The message spread really quickly throughout the Muslim world that Al-Andalus was now a sanctuary for those being persecuted by the Abbasids. The people who were still loyal to his family and the remaining few of the house of Umayyad that had, well, managed to escape death came to Spain. Amongst these was his own son, Suleiman, now barely a teenager. This was the same son who he had to say goodbye to and then flee for his life toward the Euphrates. The joys of his reunion, however, were to be short-lived. Just because he was emir didn't mean things were going to get any easier. Meanwhile, in the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, which had now been moved from Damascus to the city of Baghdad, the second caliph of the Abbasid line, Abu Ja'far Abdullah ibn Muhammad al-Mansur, had had enough of this upstart who dared to call himself an emir and went so far as to establish an Umayyad outpost on the fringe of the Islamic world, which was technically in his domain. Al-Mansur installed a new governor of North Africa, Al-Ala ibn Mughith, which, based on his title, gave him domination over Al-Andalus, which was seen as nothing more than a province. Al-Ala wasn't the type that was going to give the emir any kind of leeway. In the year 763, Al-Ala ibn Mughith landed a force of over 7,000 men in southern Portugal near the city of Beja. The locals rallied to his cause, and with this army he began a pursuit of the renegade. He chased the emir of Cordoba until he had him surrounded in the city of Carmona, where he began to lay siege. Rahman kept his forces within the city walls for over 2 months. The days took their toll, his food and water began to run out, his men started to question the loyalty of their commander. Events were looking bad. Some would say at this point he had little to lose. He handpicked 700 of his best warriors and then did something that others would consider absolutely crazy. But in my opinion, it's up there with having some major cojones like Cortez. He set fire to his own city gate, throwing his own scabbard into the fire. Symbolically, he wanted his men to know he was not going to sheathe his sword until this was resolved. But practically speaking, burning down your own city gate instills the idea that you're either going to sally forth and win or die trying. For Rahman, you either went big or you went home. And so, on his command, his men came out and attacked the Abbasid army and their siege works in full force. The chronicler Ibn Idhari takes up the story. Quote, Abd Al-Rahman ordered a fire to be built, and he ordered his companions to burn the scabbards of their swords and said to them, "Come out with me against this crowd, determined never to return." There were 700 of them, courageous men and famous heroes, so they took their swords in their hands, searching for their enemy. The battle lasted long until God did his marvelous work, and the army and companions of Al-Allah quaked and fled, and their fate became a warning for the people of the world. Al-Allah was among the first to be killed. End quote. Of course, after this stunning victory, Abd al-Rahman wanted to drive home a severe point to the Abbasid Caliph, which, come on, you can't really fault him for wanting to do this. That whole trying to wipe out your family and trying to kill you thing is a hard one to look away from. Rahman gathered up all the heads of the leaders of this invading force, and just to make sure that there was no confusion, he had all their ears properly tagged with their names, and then put them all together, preserved them in salt, put a big bow on the whole package, and had it all sent back to Al-Mansur in Baghdad. When the caliph saw this package, he exclaimed, "God be praised for placing a sea between us." Al-Mansur both began to loathe and respect this emir. He gave him the name Sacre Quraysh, meaning the falcon of the Quraysh, which was the name of the original tribe that Rahman was a part of. Because he was the archenemy of the Umayyad, it's worth noting what Al-Mansur actually said, and this is based on the chronicler Al-Athir. Of course, it may only have a kernel of truth to it, but still, if this is half of what your enemies are actually saying about you, then you must really possess some amazing skills. This is what Ibn al-Athir said, quote, Al-Mansur once posed a question to some of his confidants. He asked, "Who is the hawk of the Quraysh?" To which his confidants gave a bunch of different names, all of them incorrect, and finally exasperated, they asked him back, "Who else, O Commander of the Faithful?" To which al-Mansur replied, "Abd Al-Rahman ibn Muawiyah, who escaped by his cunning, the spearheads of the lances and the blades of the swords, traveling the desert and sailing the seas until he entered an alien territory. There, he organized cities, mobilized armies, and re-established his reign after it was completely lost by good management and strong resolve. Abd al-Rahman did it alone, and with the support of none other than his own judgment, depending on no one but his own resolve." End quote. Deep inside, Abd al-Rahman always wanted to claim vengeance on the Abbasids for what they had done to his family. He wasn't going to accomplish this. Even despite his victory in 763, he would be constantly tied down, putting down rebellions and uprisings left and right. His biggest problem now lay with the city of Zaragoza in the Upper March. Zaragoza and Barcelona had been self-proclaimed independent cities who were not keen on bending the knee to Córdoba, despite the fact that they had essentially been cornered by the emir's expansion. In 777 to 778, the governor of Zaragoza, Suleiman ibn Yoktan al-Arabi al-Kelbi, began negotiations with his Frankish neighbor across the Pyrenees. The Frankish king was none other than Charlemagne, who he wanted to employ as a mercenary against the Umayyad. Just as a side note, there were plenty of alliances like this that occurred between religions to fight a political opponent, which is why the idea of Reconquista as a broad religious movement, which was advocated by later historians, really doesn't have a lot of merit during this time period. It's difficult to say you're fighting a holy war when you have allies from the faith that you're supposedly fighting against. True to his word, Charlemagne's army arrived in Spain, and it wasn't just a small portion of it, but rather every man he could muster. Suleiman welcomed him into Barcelona, but then later at the gates of Zaragoza, the commander of the city, Hussein ibn Yahya, abruptly changed his mind and barred the city gates. Perhaps it registered in his mind that this Frankish king may have wanted to add all of Spain to his domain. The fact that he arrived with this massive force only served to heighten the level of anxiety. It would be an understatement to say that negotiations at this time broke down. However, the Frankish army couldn't stay long in Spain. On hearing of a new revolt back in France, they began to look for a way to cross back over the Pyrenees. But as the Frankish army continued to march north into Basque territory, they became entangled with the locals at Pamplona, which was essentially their capital. Charlemagne feared that they would use the city as a base to invade France in the future, and so he ordered the city walls to be destroyed and the city plundered. The Basques were not ones to forget. Charlemagne eventually managed to find a narrow pass through the Pyrenees near the city of Roncesvalles. Problem was, it would be slow going to get across the mountains, as his men would have to cross in a slender column. This was the perfect time for the Basques to exact revenge. They descended on the tail end of his line. The men in the rear of the line were commanded by a knight named Roland. He was the lord of the Breton marshes, and his rearguard action slowed down the attack. Despite being surrounded and outnumbered, he fought on and was credited with saving the rest of the line from ambush. But Roland and his men were butchered in the process. This was going to be the one and only defeat Charlemagne ever had. But this battle gained immortal notoriety. It went viral, so to speak. Roland was glorified. His deeds would become the stuff of legends. His self-sacrifice and allegiance to his king would become the blueprints for the emerging code of chivalry. So epic poems would eventually be written about this event. The Song of Roland, which was written later in the 11th century, and in my opinion was probably meant to be more religious propaganda than anything, got the history totally wrong. They had Saracens, all 400,000 of them, instead of Basque, attacking the Franks, and Charlemagne was only in Spain to fight the Muslims. Now, historical inaccuracies aside, Charlemagne went back to his side of the Pyrenees, and Abd al-Rahman I now had a free hand to subjugate the rest of his domain. The emir could have risked open warfare by attacking Zaragoza directly, but instead, Rahman simply offered Hussein, who was the head man of the city, the governorship of the entire region, and then sat back and watched as Hussein murdered the current governor Suleiman. Hussein eventually offered the emir his allegiance, but by the early 780s, even al-Hussein was bucking for independence from Cordoba, and so by this point, Rahman had solidified enough hold on Spain to build up a massive army along with 36 siege engines, and then proceeded to take Zaragoza by force. The Emirate of Cordoba had expanded nicely. The emir, however, was a man that was not just invested in expanding his territory, but also in enriching the state itself. He kept the coffers of rebuilding the infrastructure well funded, which meant roads and aqueducts were built or fixed. Bridges were created or brought up to code. Now, this wasn't all just rainbows. Spain was still a land that was divided by strife and a lot of external pressure to crush it from strong neighbors. He addressed this by creating a strong civil service with multiple administrators and a competent bureaucracy, including an intelligence-gathering service. That's right, he had his own FBI. And then he backed all this up by creating a standing army that some estimated to be about 40,000 strong. He also continued the practice of allowing religious tolerance, provided all paid their religious tax, which over the next few centuries was incentive for many to convert to Islam because if conversion did nothing else, it at least brought you down in the tax bracket. In his 30-plus years of rule, however, I'd say one of his greatest achievements was the establishment of the Great Mosque of Cordoba. The exact founding of this varies between 784 to 787, but I'd recommend that you look up pictures of this mosque online or take a look at the video accompaniment to this podcast. It's absolutely breathtaking. The horseshoe arches, the detail in the mihrab, the domes are a testament not just to Andalusian, but human engineering. It was said that the impressive columns topped by circular arches were inspired by Roman aqueducts. Some say that Abd Al-Rahman built these arched columns as reminders of the palm fronds from his beloved homeland of Syria, a place where he could never return. This mosque became a legacy. His lineage would all take turns to add a new portion as time went on. All in all, our Syrian refugee had done pretty well for himself. He had come a long way from the man who had to once swim a river in order to save his life.